morning, Slow City. How you guys doing? That was strong in the middle right there. Hey again, my name's Gerald. My wife Jenny and I and a bunch of our family are here from Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. And a lot of gratitude to you guys and the Slow City Church family. My daughter and my new son-in-law started, and their friends started here in 2019. And I didn't realize it was like a month after you guys had kicked off. They started at Cal Poly as freshmen and have been able to go on this journey with you guys over the past couple years. And as a dad, I was especially prayerful about where my daughter was going to church. So I've been praying for you guys for 4 years. Thanks for not letting me down, okay? No, they've had an incredible time here. And man, I just want to honor your church. You know, 1 out of 10 church plants make it beyond year 1. And not only that, but you guys made it through a global pandemic. Church in a parking lot, which I still don't even know how you pulled that off. But just well done, and thank you for your faithfulness and this beautiful expression. I was a student here at Cuesta, go Cougs, and went to church nearby. And this town is really special to me. It was a formative part of my life. I went on a missions trip with the church that I was part of here in town, and on that missions trip sensed a vocational calling for ministry in my own life. Ended up transferring up to Multnomah Bible College in Portland. That's where I met my wife, and the rest is history. Now we're at a church called Bridgetown up there. But just a lot of gratitude for this city, the legacy of Jesus followers here. It's been a huge part of my journey, and now my daughter and son-in-laws and their friends. So thank you, and really an honor to be here. We have been in a season in the past couple years in our church, really post coming out of COVID in 2021. We've been in the past couple years a beautiful season in our church marked by renewal. And personal for myself, my wife, and our community, it's been a time marked by just a real new connection, and I would call an outpouring of the Holy Spirit that has done a lot in our lives and shaped our community in beautiful ways. And you know, whenever there is that kind of personal encounter with the Spirit of God, it's marked by the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, but also, as you see in the book of Acts, when the Spirit of God comes in new, fresh ways, it also pushes the followers of Jesus out to the margins, to the poor, to the brokenhearted, and we begin to see some of that in our community in new, fresh ways, and it's just been really, really fun. And one of those stories is a young woman shared the story publicly, so I can share it here, but her name is Kira, and she's 30, and she actually grew up not far from here, a little bit north, near Santa Cruz, and her parents growing up were both addicts. So both mom and dad struggled with addiction, and then she has had a 10-year-long struggle with addiction herself and went through a bad breakup, was reaching out to her Nana for prayer, and finally got so bad and so desperate that she had never been a churchgoer, but Googled where to go to church in Portland and found our church and came on a Sunday. And that Sunday, a friend of ours, kind of a guest, but part of the community, was preaching, and he said something like, at the end of the sermon, some of you, there's an invitation from God, and he's saying, come home. And for her, that resonated, and he said, I'm going to do that really awkward thing. If that's you this morning and you feel like God's asking you to come home to faith in Jesus, would you stand up? And she stood up. And what happened was, I found this out later, there was another woman, 60-year-old woman, sitting next to her and saw her stand up and was like, wow, I'm going to just, say something to her and offer to meet with her. And so this woman, Jen, said, hey, I saw you stand up and, are you new to Jesus? She's like, I don't know what any of this means, but I know I need it. So this older woman took her out to coffee. They began a relationship. And then finally Kira said, okay, I'm ready. Easter Sunday, I want to get baptized. So she wanted to get baptized Easter Sunday. It's leading up to it. And she had made a promise to God. And she said, God, I want to be sober. I don't want to use any drugs or alcohol prior to my baptism. and she really struggled. And leading up to the night before her baptism, she woke up that morning resolving not to get high, and she blew it, and she did. And she still turned up Easter Sunday morning for her baptism, but she said she was just filled with guilt and shame. Just like, man, should I even be doing this? But she did it. She went, she got baptized. Afterwards, she felt great. She was so excited. And that night, to her surprise, she stayed sober. And the next night, and the next night, and now it's been 3 months plus that she's been sober after 10 years of addiction. And that's just a miraculous story that encourages me that God is at work. And if you have someone in your own life that you would love to see that story happen for them, may you just be encouraged that God is at work, stories like that in a 30-year-old young woman. So we've been in this really fun season of church, and in my own life and for my wife, we just feel in spiritual formation terms, they call a season of where you feel God's close and he's active, consolation. God's consoling you. But I just wonder, how would you name your season right now of life with God? Would you be with me like, yeah, I just feel God's presence. I see him at work, consolation. He's close. Or would you maybe perhaps describe the season as a bit of apathy, like, I don't know. Or on the other end, in spiritual formation terms, they would call it desolation, a season where you know that God's real, but he just seems far from you. You feel like you're praying and there's no one listening, but deep inside you know God's there, but you're not feeling that. Desolation. So where would you, if you had to kind of plot yourself on that spectrum today, where would you put yourself? So with that in mind, I want to direct us to this story today out of 2 Samuel 6 about God's presence. Because wherever you're at in your season of encountering God or knowing who Jesus is and following him, I think that what we see in the life of David through this story we're going to look at today, I think there is something for everyone around the centrality of God's presence. So would you turn there with me? 2 Samuel chapter 6, starting in verse 1. 2 Samuel 6, starting in verse 1. You ready? Okay, thank you. I got one, so we're going to do it. The rest of you follow along. Thank you, 2. 2 Samuel 6, here we go, verse 1. David brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the Ark of the Covenant of God, which is called by the name of Yahweh Almighty, who's enthroned between the cherubim on the Ark. Now just look up for a second. If you remember, the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubim in this whole intricate detailed place is the one place on earth where God would reside. His presence, his glory would reside in this Ark of the Covenant. So David's going out with all these men to grab that physical structure. And it says, verse 3, they set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guarding the new cart, guiding it, and with the Ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. Now David and all of Israel, this is a big crowd, were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. So can you picture this? They've got the ark on this cart. They're bringing it out where it's been kind of forgotten on the hillside, and they're bringing it in this big procession into the center of Jerusalem. And David and all the people are out in front of it, and they're dancing and they're worshiping and they're celebrating. It says they were celebrating with all their might before their Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums. Does anybody know what a sistrum is? Any sistrum players here? No, okay. I had to look it up. It's some kind of metallic shaker type thing. I'm glad nobody plays that anymore. And cymbals. So they're coming in with all of this kind of music and singing. Skip with me now to verse 14. Wearing a linen ephod, and the linen ephod, if you know back to the Levitical law, was the kind of the undergarment that the priest would wear. So like the priest's underwear. They would put like a robe over that and all kind of regalia. But this is like the undergarment of the priest. It's kind of weird. So David's wearing this linen ephod. He's dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. Quite a big commotion. And as the ark of the Lord was entering into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, who's David's wife, is watching from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Uh-oh. They brought the ark of the Lord, set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. And then skip down to verse 20. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, David's wife, came out to meet him and said, "How the king has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls, of the servants, as any vulgar fellow would do." She's not happy. But David immediately responds back, "It was before the Lord that I was dancing, whom chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this." He's like, look, if you didn't like that, you're not going to like what's coming. "And I will be humiliated even in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you speak of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. So, a little bit of background. Context of what's happening here. This is a dark time in the nation of Israel. They've forgotten God's law, justice is being perverted, and all of this really began when God's people asked for a king. Now the deal was, Yahweh, the God of the universe, said, "I will be your king." And they were like, that's great, but we're looking at all the other nations around us, and they have like an actual guy that we can see that sits on a throne. We want one of those. And the Lord's like, really? And they're like, really? He's like, okay. And he gave them Saul. Now Saul, good king or bad king? Bad king. Saul rejected the word of the Lord. He didn't care what God was saying to the people. He abandoned the ark of God. That's how it ended up on this hillside outside of town anyways. And he didn't honor God, and he was not a just leader and didn't care for people and human flourishing. Now again, remember, the ark is the place where heaven and earth meet, the very presence and glory of God. God's like, this is going to be the hot spot where I'll be. And Saul's like, nah, just leave it outside of town, right? So it's a time marked by intense pride and self-sufficiency in Israel. They basically became a culture and a people, a nation that thought, you know what? We can do this on our own. We don't need God. Could you imagine that? What would that be like to live in a country where nobody cared for God's rule and his thoughts and thought they could do it themselves? Anyways, maybe some of you have experienced that. So right in the midst of this, God is developing a leader, a young shepherd boy out in the hill country, David. He's a young man marked by two powerful ingredients for leadership: humility and hunger for God. And the more I go on my own leadership journey, I don't know if there could be two better character qualities in a leader than those two things: humility and hunger for God. And David's humility and devotion to God makes him a foil character to Saul. It's like literally the exact opposite. So David's out tending sheep, worshiping the Lord, writing poetry to God, and he is preparing for one day to be king. Now, if you know the story, what happens is the prophet Samuel goes to David, picks him, says, you're going to be king of Israel. But there's a 7-year gap between when David is anointed with oil to be the king and when he actually comes in for his coronation day. 7 years. So 7 years, David is outside of town, dreaming, praying, and imagining, what will it be like? How will I enter into the city to be installed as king? Like, what's that moment going to be like? Now, the first day of any job is important, right? Like, we've got some young graduates here. Well done, guys. And even my friend Josh just started a new job, and his first day of his new job was an important day. He's working in finance. He has to wear a suit. And I don't know what the deal was, Josh, exactly, but maybe you hadn't tried on the suit beforehand. But he, on his first day, went to plug in a laptop or something and split the back of his suit. And then what I didn't know was that the way that a coworker said, well, man, you should go into the bathroom and staple that shut. But the problem was, as you explained, it was like to get enough material for the stapler made the back even tighter. So Josh had his first day of work where he had to be very careful how he moved in his pants. But first, right, Josh? First day of a job, it's important. King David knew that, so he's going to enter into the first day. I didn't ask Josh if I could tell the story, but I knew him well enough to know. And his mom just said, yeah. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. So David's first day, like a new president coming into office, is going to be really monumental. I mean, the first day should be marked by kind of what you want your legacy to be like, right? It's a statement. First day of a president, the first act of a president defines their rule. Same thing for King David. He wants to inspire confidence in the people. He wants to create momentum and a new direction. So David, preparing for his inauguration, his opening act as king, the day finally comes, the throne is his, and here's the plan. And I can only imagine him with his strategist telling them, and he's like, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the Ark of the Covenant that's been outside in the hill country, and we're going to bring it in to the center of Jerusalem, to the town square. I'm going to make this tent for it. We're going to remove the veil so that the ark will be visible and accessible to everyone. Then he says, and what we're going to do, and you can read about this in 1 Chronicles, he says, what we're going to do is we're going to hire thousands of singers and musicians, and we're going to have night and day worship to our God Yahweh in the center of the city. And you know what, guys? I did the calculations. This is going to take our entire, all that we have, all of our finances for the whole nation, we're going to pour into this project. And you can only imagine his strategists are like, hey man, that sounds awesome, love your heart for God, but have you thought about the military? Have you thought about the fact that we're surrounded by our enemies that literally want to wipe us off the face of the earth? Have you thought about our economy that's in shambles due to your predecessor? How about some economic stimulus? And David says, no, we're going to empty the entire national treasury on night and day worship and honoring God in the center of the city. David was convinced God was worth this. It reminds me of the woman that came to worship Jesus and brought a really expensive perfume worth a year's wages. And she pours it out on Jesus' feet and wipes the perfume with her hair. And do you remember what some of the disciples said when she did that? They said, what a waste. And Jesus said, not at all. This is appropriate, extravagant, but appropriate worship. And I think that's what is exactly in King David's heart. You see, King David had experienced what it was like to have a man rule Israel, and it wasn't great. And now he wants to reestablish Yahweh as the king again. This is a dawn of a whole new era. They're going to crown Yahweh as king. Yahweh is going to be the King of glory, ruling the nation again. But the question in my mind, as I've thought through this story, is how? I mean, think about that. How do you have the God who you can't see, who is not visible on a throne necessarily, how do you have that God rule and reign? Well, you get a little insight, a little glimpse into David's heart and his thinking through Psalm 22. In Psalm 22, David says, God is enthroned on the praises of his people. In other words, imagine this for a minute. Even as we, the people of God today, in an environment like this, in a corporate worship setting, we come together and we honor God by singing. We declare that Jesus is King. When we do that together, somehow God and his presence is enthroned on our praises. David wanted to enthrone God through night and day praise and worship. And now think about this for a minute. Isn't that fascinating? That when we lift up praise together and we sing and declare that Jesus has defeated death and sin, that there's hope. I can have hope regardless of what you're facing. You can have hope because Jesus is back for the dead. God is for you, not against you. When we sing that together, when we declare that together, we are in this realm on earth creating agreement with the heavenly realm. Because just follow me here for a minute. In heaven right now, in God's presence, there is night and day worship and honor of Jesus as King. So we know this because we see these glimpses, like in Revelation 4, there's these kind of crazy, mysterious, exotic scenes of worship. It's King Jesus, the Lamb that was slain, but now that is alive, that's purchased people from every tribe and tongue and nation. He's seated on the throne, and there's these creatures, and then there's elders, and there's this nonstop worship where they're singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lamb who was slain." That's what's happening in heaven. And we would say it like this. In heaven, according to Jesus, God's will is being done. That's why we're taught to pray, may God's kingdom come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, all the beings and all the persons acknowledge Jesus as King. And they live in such a way and honor and worship that's fitting to that. On earth, it's not true, right? However, when we come together in an environment like this, on a Sunday for corporate worship together, we are mimicking the reality of heaven. That's literally what our worship gatherings are. They're mirroring this worship gathering where Jesus is exalted. And in some way, when we do that, God is here in a unique, special way among us. That's why perhaps you've had the experience where all week long you've been stressed, things are difficult, work, family, life, whatever, health, and then you come into a worship context like this, and you kind of get caught up sometimes into a new way of thinking, which is, it's going to be okay. Jesus is actually back from the dead. He's for me. And perhaps you've even been in a worship gathering like this, and you're not even there yet. You're not even able to sing, but the people to the right or your left, they're singing. And before you know it, you feel faith rising in your own heart where you're like, man, God, you do love me. You are for me. And what that is, that experience is the presence of God. As God's people worship him, he comes in his presence among them. David knows this. And he wants this environment for the entire nation of Israel. That's what he's attempting. David wants this environment of praise and presence 24/7 in Israel. So that as people went about their daily lives, I mean, imagine that. And I always picture like a European town square. Perhaps you've been somewhere in Europe, you can imagine that. And in the center of the square is this tent with night and day worship going on. So that means that as people are going about their daily lives, in the background, they're hearing the worship of God. Isn't that fascinating? As merchants are buying and selling, as kids are running around playing in the street, as David and his government officials are conducting business in the palace, all the time you could hear the faint music of the worshipers. Going to bed at night, you hear it. Rising in the morning, you hear it. So what is David's new political, economic, and military strategy for Israel? What is his government platform and foundation? God's presence. God enthroned through night and day praise. He's putting God and is dwelling at the center of daily life, reestablishing Yahweh as king. And think about our nation and the struggles in our country today. There's a lot of companies that are laying off workers. There's all this talk, are we in a recession? Are we about to be in a recession? What's coming? We have a deeply divided nation politically. Some would say that in the history of our nation, it's the most divided we've ever been. In Portland, we have what's called Portland fake nice, where people are like, oh, you know, we're for the refugee, the immigrant, we're for everybody, we believe in love. And in Portland, I don't know if you know this, a car will even stop for you if you're pedestrian, and there doesn't even have to be a crosswalk. There's some general Portland niceness, but I've found that it's a fake nice, that just right under the fake niceness is a current of anger. If you don't recycle or you don't bring your bag to the grocery store or whatever, there's I'm kidding about those examples, but the anger is real. Because what we're in a secular moment, I would say, as a nation, and particularly even beyond our nation in the West, where we're told that we came by chance through primordial ooze, and yet we're told that we're supposed to uphold these Christian virtues and values like kindness, forgiveness, respect, tolerance, which are all great. But the only problem is you can't have the kingdom of God without the king. You can't, as an individual, uphold these high values of love and respect and kindness without the power of God. So we're living in a failed experiment right now. But what if, as God's people, in this context that we're in, this very real world that we're living and breathing in, what if we lived like God was truly among us? See, we don't have the temple in the center of our downtown with night and day worship, but the New Testament tells us that we are the temple of God now. What if we were honoring God's presence as we went about our day? I think what David is sharing, the secret this morning that David wants to communicate to us through this is this. If you put God and his glory at the center, everything else falls into place. Like David, but in our lives, if we put God's presence at the center, everything else falls into place. Listen, before David was anything else, before he was a king, he was a worshiper. He had sat on the hillside, developing this heart, this hunger for God. And you see a little bit of this heart that I pray would begin to live in you today. And here's where it is, Psalm 27:4. Listen to this heart and see if you find resonance in your own desire with this. David says, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. David found this one thing, the best thing, and he ordered all of his life around that. And he was inviting Israel back into this face-to-face encounter with the living God. But when David came in as king, he was basically saying, look, I'm not the king, Yahweh is. I am foremost a worshiper. That's why David came in with the priest's undergarments on. It was a prophetic act, a statement to Israel saying, you expect me to come and rule and reign like Saul with authority and swagger and all of that, but I'm not. I'm coming in like a holy fool. I'm coming in with the undergarments of the priest, and I'm declaring to you, I'm calling you back to your true identity. See, the identity of God's people all along was to be worshipers and a nation of priests. And of course, in this moment, not everybody is excited about it. And I say to you this morning too, if you make these kind of adjustments to put God as the center, there will be challenges for sure. David's was very personal. It was his own wife who was like, I don't know what you're doing out there dancing and dressed like that, but it's humiliating to me. And he's like, I don't care. I found the best thing. God's presence, his glory, it's so far greater than anything else. It's interesting too, because later, I think David's tent is foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do in the temple. Because David in his tent removed the veil so that there was access to God's presence, just as Jesus tears the temple at his resurrection. Also, you hear the statement of Jesus as he's quoting Isaiah saying, "My Father's house will be a house of prayer for all nations." In other words, David, with equal access into the presence of God, is foreshadowing what Jesus offers to us now. Now listen, this is in some ways lofty, high theology that's like, man, well, okay, what does this mean for me today? And here's where my heart went on this. You know, one of the most heartbreaking things that I've experienced in the past couple years, post-2020, coming out of the pandemic and all that kind of stuff, one of the most heartbreaking things for me has been friends, family members, people that I was very close with, that were walking with Jesus, that were coming regularly to church, even some that shared a table in a small group setting. And it's broken my heart to see one after one of these people fall away, to discontinue meeting with God's people, and in some places just to full on declare that they no longer believe. It's just crushing. And you know, I feel like 2020 and the pandemic was a pruning for all of us, for followers of Jesus, for our churches. But in some, the pruning was severe, so severe that they completely gave up on church and following after Jesus. But if I'm honest, like, as a follower of Jesus, there are seasons in my own life when I'm distracted, where the center of everything that I'm focused on isn't Jesus and his kingdom. And think about it, there are good things for me, and probably for you, good things that can distract us and become the ultimate focus of our life. Like, for instance, you know, we have our youngest daughter is graduating from high school and is going off to college, which is awesome. We're about to be empty nesters. We don't know what that's like, but we're very excited. This is great. But here's the thing. If you as a parent make your kids the center of your life, at some point, they move out. If you make your career the focal point, at some point, your career will end or change. Or if it's a hobby, then what happens when you can no longer physically do that hobby anymore? If it's a new relationship, what happens when that relationship ends or changes? You see, what I'm getting at is we need a center of gravity in our lives greater than career, hobbies, relationships, or kids. We need something with more mass than all of that to be the gravitational pull of our lives. And see, David ordered his life around the most weighty reality: God's glory and presence. Now, if I'm to press in further, it's like, okay, I hear that creates this desire in me and this hunger. I want that. But what exactly are we talking about? Like, when David went into the tent, what did he see? What was that? Well, David, he's writing about the majesty, the beauty, the splendor of God. He's clearly obsessed with it. And I think what he saw is what Jacob saw in that moment when the angels were ascending and descending from heaven. I think it's what Ezekiel saw in his image and visions, and what Isaiah saw, and what the disciples perhaps saw when they saw Jesus transfigured right before them. And I think it's what John saw on the Isle of Patmos when he saw and wrote and described the revelation. I think what they saw was just a glimpse of God's radiant glory. You see, there is a reality that we don't see with our eyes in the natural world. See, the Western scientific rational worldview wants you to believe that you can only know and experience what you see or what you can test empirically. But in contrast to that, the worldview of Jesus and the scriptures says that there is an invisible, unseen world all around you. that is real, I might even say more real than what you see. Do you remember that story in 2 Kings chapter 6 with Elisha and his servant? And the servant is like, hey, I guess this is it. We're done. We're surrounded by the enemy. They're closing in on us. It's over. And Elisha prays this prayer, and he says, God, would you open his eyes that he could see the reality of what's around us? And God does. He opens up Elisha's servant's eyes, and the servant looks around, and beyond the enemy is another wider circle of the Lord's army, clearly outnumbering the enemy. And all of a sudden, his eyes are open to what's real. And friends, I think that's what we need. We need our eyes opened again to reality, to what is actually real. And this is what saints and mystics, the church mothers and fathers, have known over the years. And this is simply it. That when we behold God in our mind, in prayer and worship, we begin to see his glory. You know, Dallas Willard says that the way that we mainly encounter God is in our thoughts. Isn't that interesting? The main way we relate to God is through our thoughts. And we can take our thoughts and open them up in prayer and in worship and encounter God in a way that's real and begin to encounter his presence, his thoughts for us, and even his glory. And this center of all reality, this is actually a person, a loving, compassionate person, and it's Jesus. We can become aware of the eternal one, Jesus, as we press into him in prayer and worship. When we turn down all the other noise around us, we press in the language of David, we seek his face, we can encounter the most captivating, beautiful person in all of reality. The Lamb that was slain, who is alive, Jesus. And that's what we see in Revelation 4 and in these heavenly, kind of apocalyptic, exotic descriptions. You see the angels, the elders, the creatures worshiping this Lamb that was slain, and it's Jesus. And I don't know about you, but more than anything, I want to see that. I want to encounter God and a glimpse of his glory. And you hear that in David. He's like, oh, just to taste it. Just a glimpse of that love I can live off of all day long. I imagine David having these cabinet meetings and he like sneaks out, goes into the temple of God's glory, and he's like, and then he goes back into the cabinet meeting, you know. And it's something like that. But how? How do we do this in our busy, digital, modern age? How do we do this? How do we keep this reality before our minds? We don't have the tent of David in downtown San Luis Obispo where you can just go in and hear worship and encounter God. We don't have that. So how do we create that? Well, just a couple thoughts for you on that. Number one, make space. We will never encounter God without making space. And this could be just space as the first 5 or 10 minutes of your morning, or this could be something more physical, like actual physical space, like a prayer room. We've done that in our church where we've decided to make a part of our church this prayer room where you can go in for a dedicated time of prayer. Perhaps that would be helpful. Perhaps for you, making space is redeeming your commute. If you drive somewhere regularly, what if you use that time for worship? You found worship. I've been loving the Upper Room, Abby Gamboa, Jeremy Riddle, and I have these tracks that I get in the car and I turn on worship, and my 20-minute commute back and forth to the office is my small little tent of David. It's a time where I'm listening and I'm alone with God, learning to worship and hearing and being encouraged. So make space. Second idea, this might be helpful, is slow down. You know, I've realized getting around Portland, I have 3 speeds. Car speed, which is like I'm in my car and I'm in this steel and glass little thing and I'm going fast. I'm not talking to anybody. I'm just in my zone and I'm going car speed. Second speed is bike speed. I'm a fair weather biker. If the weather's good, I like to ride my bike. Bike speed's a little bit slower. You feel the wind. You can hear someone as you pass them, but you're still cruising. But the third speed is walking speed. And walking speed, you can actually smell the roses this time of year. You can stop and look somebody in the eyes and actually greet them on walking speed. And I think to encounter God in our daily lives, we need to slow down at some moment in the day to walking speed. To slow your thoughts down. To perhaps encounter God through silence and solitude. To let all of the busyness of our internal world slow down, that you can hear his still small voice. Third idea to make this a reality is something that we've been practicing and learning called a daily prayer rhythm, which is ordering your day around 3 times of prayer. You see this in the life of Daniel. Remember, he would stop at those appointed times, turn towards Jerusalem and pray. You see it in David. You see it in Jesus and the apostles. It seems to be this ancient practice of morning, midday, and evening prayer. So we've been experimenting with this and practicing this. Instead of ordering your day around meal times, what if you ordered it around prayer? 3 set times where you connected with God. So those are just some thoughts of how to bring this into reality. But let's end with this. I want to end just one more time reading the scripture over you. And my prayer is that this heart of David, this hunger and desire for God, would create hunger in you. So one more time, would you listen to these words? David says, "One thing I ask of the Lord, this only do I seek, that I would dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." Amen.